Let's continue our discussion by looking at the experience of Jews during the period of early settlement in the Iberian Peninsula. Now, one of the things that's really important to understand about this entire period is that there is an Iberian exception. And what I mean, now, so why is the Iberian Peninsula different? Really crucial. The Iberian Peninsula represents an unusual moment in Jewish history where you have three major monotheistic cultures interacting with each other for an extended period of time. Put in other words, um, for most of the last 2,000 years of Jewish history, the majority of Jews have either lived under Muslim rule or under Christian rule. And there's a lot of interesting contrasts and comparisons that hopefully we'll be engaging in as we go through this history over the next year or so of lectures. But in Spain, and to a certain degree in Portugal, you have this unusual environment where Jews, Muslims, and Christians interact in a triangular culture rather than in a binary culture. So, for example, if we pick, let's say, medieval England, you would have this tiny Jewish population as a minority within a large Christian population. Or if we look at, I don't know, Egypt, you'll have a tiny Jewish population within a large Muslim population. And the way in which Jews interact with their host culture is quite different than we have in Spain, where because of the changing power dynamics of three cultures, two of which who are really vying for rulership of the entire peninsula, the Jews have an unusual opportunity to flourish. And in fact, they do, especially in the Muslim period, which we're going to discuss in a little more detail. So let's just put that on hold. And I'd like to quickly introduce this subject by looking at the various periods of Jewish history as most historians have defined them. The first, which we'll talk about in this lecture, is the early settlement and the early Visigothic period. That is the first time we have any sense of Jews inhabiting the peninsula and what we might be able to know about their experience from the 5th century onward when the region was dominated by the Visigoths. Secondly, you have a kind of sub-period of the Visigoths, let's call it the Catholic period, when the Visigoths switch from one form of Christianity, Arian Christianity, to Catholic Christianity. And that represents a really significant shift in terms of how they relate to the Jews. Then that ends with the year 711 rather abruptly with the invasion of Muslim forces. And so this initiates the Islamic period as the Muslims make their way up from the south of the peninsula all the way up to the Pyrenees. This is the Islamic period. Now, most of the activity is focused in the southern region, in Granada and Cordoba, but there is some fascinating things that are happening here. This is what's often called the golden era of Spanish Jewry, somewhat of an overblown term, but nevertheless there's a lot of merit to it, as we shall see later on in this course. Now, the Christians begin to push back from the north, and that is called the Reconquista, or the reconquest of Spain. It happens slowly. The northern part, the northern sections, of course, are conquered first, and it's only in 1482 when the Muslims officially lose even their toehold in the south. But during this period, which overlaps with the Muslim period because the northern section will be Christian, the southern section will be Muslim, that's also very significant for our study of the Jews because the Christians, when they reconquer the peninsula, will have a very different orientation toward their Jewish minority than we would see under the Muslims. And then finally, although of course there is the dramatic and terrifying expulsion of the Jews in 1492, and then subsequent developments in Portugal with a forced conversion and also a mass migration in 1497, you have what I'd like to call the crypto-Jewish period, because there's still a very significant population of Jews living as Christians in the Iberian Peninsula. And there's a whole spectrum of what that really means. There are some Jews who are like just clamoring to get back to their Jewish practices, but are feigning Catholicism simply for the time being. And on the other end of the spectrum, you have Jews who become enthusiastic adopters of a new faith. And along that spectrum is quite a range of people. There's also a significant expatriate community, particularly those Spanish Jews who fled to Portugal and then sometimes a generation or three later left Portugal only to readopt their Jewish identity in the diaspora. So the crypto-Jewish period is not only what happens in Spain itself, Spain and Portugal, but really what happens in their diasporas as well. So that will take us right up to the contemporary period. So these are like 5 basic ways to divide up the period that we have before us. We're going to concentrate right now on the early settlement. Here's a great map from an atlas the Barnavi Atlas that I recently had a chance to examine, and it gives you a sense of the scattering of Jewish population around the Mediterranean basin in the 1st through the 3rd century. So it's a little bit rough because each black square is the same size as every other black square, and that's clearly not reflective of the size of the Jewish population there. You also have that kind of starburst that shows that it's an important Christian community, and I think there's a lot more important Christian communities than Alexandria and Rome, but nevertheless, in Antioch, nevertheless, still gives you a sense of the early diaspora, the early scattering of the Jews that extends all the way up to London and into what would be later France and Germany. But of course, Spain is an extremely important region. And as you can see from the shading, the kind of darker orange is where it's really strong by the end of the 1st century, which is concentrated in the Eastern Mediterranean, what will be Turkey, Asia Minor. But by the time you get to the 3rd century, yeah, we've got some significant suggestions of Jewish populations all the way out on the Atlantic coast in what would be the Iberian Peninsula. So who are these Jews? They are known as Sephardim, which comes from a passage in the book of Ovadia, biblical book of Ovadia, which refers to the people who are in exile from Jerusalem, and that community is known as Sepharad. The modern Hebrew term for Spain is Sepharad, taken from this verse in Ovadia, and the people who come from the region are called Sephardim, which is the plural in Hebrew for someone who comes from the region. Sepharadi is the adjective, which would be used to refer to one person or to things which pertain to Sepharad. Now, there's really no good reason to assume that when the book of Ovadia specifically calls a place Sfarad, that it is referring to what we call Sfarad today. This is a common thing that happens in Jewish geography, that when Jews visit far-off places or settle there, sometimes they will take on biblical names when we don't really have any specific connections to say that this is that place. Case in point, Ashkenaz is one of the names of a person mentioned in Genesis. And when the Jews reached northern Germany, they said, okay, here we go. Let's call this place Ashkenaz, right? Maybe the people who descended from Ashkenaz live here, and hence we call it Ashkenaz, but there's really no reason to say so. So it's a very tenuous connection, but nevertheless the term has stuck, and it is useful because it does refer to a distinct group of people and a distinct geography, but nevertheless no real reason to assume that in the book of Ovadia they're actually referring to what we call Spain. There are Talmudic references several hundred years later which refer to Aspamia. This is a little bit more realistic given the period, let's say 1st through 3rd century. We've already got Jews living there, and it sounds a lot like Hispania, and very common kind of shifting of vowels and consonants that you have between Latin and Aramaic. So by the time we get to the Talmud, there's no question that there is reference to Spain and some familiarity with it. But how early did the Jews originally settle in this region? So we have a couple of really early reference points which are probably not true. For example, in the 16th century, one particular writer came across a gravestone that apparently read, "Here lies Adoniram, who was the tax collector for King Solomon." Now, that's like incredible. And I mean that literally, incredible. It's just way too much to assume that King Solomon, we're talking like, 1,000 years before the Common Era, had actually some tax collectors going as far out as Spain. So, and it's the fact that we've lost this particular reference and it is dubious, it's probably not a reliable source to suggest that there were Jews living there 1,000 years before the Common Era. Another one that does not necessarily negate the idea of Jews living in Spain, but is also regarded as quite spurious, is apparently a letter from the Jews living in Toledo sent to Judea asking that the Jews in Israel refrain from crucifying Jesus. And this would have been dated about the year 30 of the Common Era. Also kind of a far-fetched document. It doesn't date anywhere near to this period, but it falls within a kind of a trope where in the medieval period, Jews had it in their interests to demonstrate that they had early settlement in order to document and to bolster their arguments for things like charter rights, for privileges to live in a particular area, to pursue certain tasks. If they could demonstrate the antiquity of their settlement, then that could help them in whatever local negotiations they might have. This will be especially important in Europe when medieval charters are put into place, but that's beyond our scope right now. It also indicates a level of, kind of an obsequious appeal to Christians, specifically saying we're not like those Jews who crucified Jesus. We're completely separate. We wanted to have nothing to do with it, which stretches our ability to believe that Jews in Spain knew something about what was going on in Judea at that time, particularly when we have no other records of Jews really talking about this, other than, of course, Christian sources like the New Testament. So these sources are hard to believe, and we can't really place Jewish settlement in Spain this early as a result of them. We do have, however, a lot of really cool pieces of evidence which suggest something around this period. This is, by the way, a beautiful image from the famous Sarajevo Haggadah. This is a Haggadah that was composed in medieval Spain and later smuggled out and found its way to Sarajevo. There's a fascinating character, by the way. The bottom left, you see there is a mysterious dark-skinned woman. In this particular representation, she looks kind of blue-skinned. In other JPEGs, she looks a little bit more brown. But a lot of questions about who is that woman? She's clearly participating in the meal with eating a piece of matzah, but she has a different complexion than the other women there. She is seated somehow separately from them. Or is that just coincidence? The artist chose to put it that way. She's also dressed a little bit differently, but she's clearly, part of the ceremony. Fascinating. We have a much more reasonable 18th century tradition that of a discovery of a gravestone. And the gravestone was partial, and again, like the gravestone of the purported Adoniram, it is missing. However, it's a much more reasonable historical source, so there's an inclination to be more tolerant of it. This is from Adra, and the inscription apparently originally read in Latin, something like Unia, a girl's name, Salomonula, the daughter of Solomon, like let's say Unia bat Shlomo, an uno, 1 year, mens cuatro, 4 months, dia uno, 1 day, and then finally, Judaya, a Jewess. So this, if it is authentic, and there's good argument to suggest it is the first real mention of a Jew living in Spain, and it dates from the 3rd century. It's fascinating, and it's tragic how you can see that the father specifically laid out exactly how old she was when she died, right down to the day. But he regarded it as very significant that he note that she was a Jewess, the Jewess of a town called Adra. I find this very moving. At any rate, we don't have this, in hand anymore, but it is a significant indicator. We also have a literary evidence of the possibility of Jews in Spain from the first century in the Christian scriptures. In Romans chapter 15, there's a discussion there where Paul indicates his desire to go visit Spain. And the reason why this is specifically a good possibility of seeing a Jewish population there is because Paul used to specifically go to Jewish communities as they tended to attract potential Christian converts, that Paul enjoyed visiting those communities that had a lot of Jewish population and then kind of like fellow travelers or interested populations that were a market for the ideas that Paul was, disseminating at these times. So quite possible that if Paul wanted to go to Spain, he wanted to go there for a good reason, meaning there were Jews already living there who would have attracted some proto-monotheists who would consider Christianity as a religious option. We also have an amphora that was discovered in Ibiza that has 2 Hebrew letters, so it indicates at least the possibility of trade in the region. It's quite a bit earlier. It's also first century, but doesn't necessarily indicate that it originated there. But by the time we get to the 4th century, then it's pretty clear that it's important to the church, at least, to talk about Jews living in the region. Again, I'm going to qualify this in a second, but basically we have a very important church synod or council in a town called Elvira, and there's a whole bunch of Jewish legislation in the deliberations and decisions of this particular council. There are very clear bans in these documents on intermarriage, bans on social dining. That is, Christians are forbidden to engage in, recreational dining with Jews. And one of my favorite passages, a very strong adjuration that Christians must not allow Jews to bless their crops, meaning that Pedro can't say to his friend Baruch, "Hey, you're Jewish. I know you have a close connection with the big guy. Come by to my field, please, and give it a blessing so we can get a good crop." Now, the reason why this is somewhat problematic is because although it suggests that these things were happening, it doesn't necessarily mean that they were. They could be kind of like, testimonials to faith that are just inserted in these kinds of documents to sort of explain that, don't worry, we're following the party line on all of these issues. Doesn't actually mean that there are Jews who are doing these things with Christians. On the other hand, sometimes the specificity of these things does suggest that it's more realistic. Like, for example, a ban on intermarriage, sure, that's pretty standard. A ban on owning Christian slaves, Jews should not own Christian slaves. Okay, we hear that too. But mixed dining, blessing the crops, those sound sort of specific. Like, let's say, for example, I understand there are laws on the books here in America that also, prohibit a person from riding his horse in, certain areas of New York City. Now, nobody rides horses except for policemen and maybe those guys with the special carriages. So it doesn't apply to anyone, but there's no point in taking that law off the books. And even if you renew the law code for whatever reason, I mean, it doesn't hurt if you just keep it in there. That doesn't mean that there are actually horses riding in the streets. But if there's something really detailed that says something like, people are forbidden from riding their horses in Manhattan, especially when we are, building new cell phone towers, right? So, oh, look at that. There's a detail there that places it within the modern period and makes it more suggestive that it might actually happen that people are riding horses and interfering with the cell phone construction. Kind of a stretched example. At any rate, so it's possible that the Council of Elvira was actually talking about real Jews engaging in real relationships with Christians, but we simply don't know for sure. One more source, which is a letter from Bishop Severus of Minorca in the year 418, is also quite tendentious and could easily be entirely fabricated. But again, the level of detail suggests that such a thing actually happened. In this particular letter that the bishop wrote, he refers to a local conflict between Jews in a Christian community, and he specifically numbers the Jews. I mean, the level of detail and specificity suggests that it's more realistic than not. They have in this particular letter, which is fascinating for lots of reasons, he depicts a situation in which Jews not only get along with Christians, but they actually have some level of authority. They serve in kind of like municipal councils and so on. And in the end, these Jews are forcibly converted to Christianity. And it's possible that the entire story is entirely fabricated, perhaps for religious propaganda purposes. But there are some thematic elements in the story that are quite ominous, as we shall see this reported in much more authentic sources for several hundred years afterwards. What we can say with some reliability, though, is that by the 3rd century, there are some Jews living in Spain. It is certainly on the periphery of the Jewish world, but this population will certainly increase. And by the time we get to the early 8th century and the Muslim conquest, we'll certainly have a much better sense of the size and the distribution of that population. But let's turn now to the Visigothic period.